Hi, I'm Dr. Robert Childs. Welcome to Empire State Engagements. On today's episode, I spoke with Dr. Kara Murphy Schlichting about her book, New York Recentered. We talked about the role of the environment in making the modern metropolis, the creative push and pull between central planners and peripheral priorities, and the value of approaching this history at the grassroots level.
Local history and local municipal archives, neighborhood libraries, branch libraries are places we can still tell new histories about New York.
I am excited to be joined today by Dr. Kara Murphy Schlichting. Dr. Schlichting is Assistant Professor of History at Queens College, City University of New York, and she's joining us today to talk about her wonderful book, and it is New York Recentered, which is a fantastic and important revisionist history of the making of modern New York City, and a work of environmental history, urban history, political history. It touches on so many important themes in late 19th and early 20th century United States. And so I'm just overjoyed to have her joining us on the show today. So welcome, Kara.
Lovely to be here, Rob.
So first of all, there's something you ask in the beginning of your book, and I think you answer it in a number of ways throughout. Who counts as a city builder? Tell me how your book sort of reframes generally, and how your work sort of reframes what we think of when we think of urban history. You challenge certain notions about development from the center to the periphery, from the top down, et cetera. But I'd love to let you talk about that as a sort of opening, and then we'll get into some of the fun stories from the book.
Excellent. All right. So the question is, who counts as a city builder? And I was curious about this because I was in graduate school. This is a book that came out of my dissertation, and I was in graduate school at Rutgers, which is the State University of New Jersey. And I was living in New York and commuting. And I was very aware of two things: of the networks of regular people that moved through the metropolitan region in the early 21st century. And I was aware that New York is often, when we say the word New York, what we often mean is Manhattan. But as a graduate student of limited means, the places that I could experience New York were often the outer boroughs. And add to that, I was part of this kind of commutation network where I would go to Penn Station and I would take the train to New Jersey, or I was raised in Connecticut, and sometimes I would take the train from New Jersey to Penn Station, walk across to Grand Central, across Midtown, and then take the train out to visit my mom and dad. And so I was living this really metropolitan regional existence as a person with no power, and Manhattan was only a tiny corner of the New York that I was experiencing. And so I was curious about this fascination, rightly so, with the power brokers of Manhattan. And of course, we should think about powerful mayors and city builders. You and I have already started talking this meeting about Robert Moses. He's kind of inescapable, and you're like an expert in a powerful governor. And so there's a real role to these powerful city builders. And if we take an imaginary perspective and you think, where does the perspective of this person or this story, where's it situated? And in my mind, those stories are situated in Manhattan. Maybe with Al Smith, it's Albany. But so often, the way we situate in our mind's eye where the stories are coming from is Manhattan. And from my experience, Manhattan was just the thing I was moving through to get to the other corners of my metropolitan life. And I thought that probably wasn't just my story, because being at Rutgers and taking social history courses, I was very interested in that classic history from the bottom up. And I was also taking urban history courses, which particularly in the fields of history of planning tend to be top down because of where the archives lie. And there's really good reasons to do that history that way. And so I wanted to know, what if I got to New York City's history? If I got to it through a kind of mobile metropolitan region and everyday people? And what if regular people making regular everyday choices in their neighborhoods and on their blocks also had a say in how the city's form developed, but also what the idea of a metropolitan region was? So it was a little bit of being inspired by my own mobility and my own location on the I was better off in the economic fringes of the outer boroughs, as lots of graduate students are. And think about what that looked like in the past.
That's great. So you were living in this sort of regionalism that you described the creation of in this work. Well, I think it's a really fascinating approach, because you sort of turn on its head this old attitude toward urban planning and city building history. And there's a few characters who pop up in your narrative who maybe the more traditional approach would center on, but whose grand schemes really get completely transformed and moved in different directions by local actors. One of them was Andrew H. Green and his sort of grand view of New York moving up into the Bronx. And you tell this wonderful story. I think it's in the second chapter. I want to go back to the first chapter later, but while we're on this idea of different people, sort of different interests interfering with the centralized plans, I love your stories about the birth of the Bronx and the way people view waterways, which of course, another important contribution you have is sort of centering the shoreline, and I'd love to talk more about that moving along. But let's talk about how all of a sudden somebody like Andrew Green can recognize that a river like the Harlem River is no longer a border, but rather something that can bring people together. And yet it's not him, but rather a lot of sort of, at the time, isolated upstart communities who are seeking connection that are really pushing this birth of the Bronx as you describe it.
Mm-hmm. So Andrew Green is a really good example of a figure that has new things to say if we get outside Manhattan. So Andrew Haswell Green is best known as the father of Greater New York. He's a civic leader who pushes for the five-borough city that is eventually consolidated in 1898. So I started to read his papers and the reports that he helped write as part of the Board of Commissioners of Central Park, and then in his advocacy for the consolidation of the five-borough modern city, to think about how he wrote about the edges. And I, of course, was going to New Jersey and thinking about Connecticut and thinking about the five boroughs. But I understood that there's that tension of regional scaled history and local history, that you have to make choices and thread a line. And I decided to pick just two corners of the metropolitan periphery to focus on. And there was a great argument to be made that this book should have been written thinking about Greater New York and New Jersey, and that relationship, not just the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, but the long history of that these two states on either side of the mighty Hudson and how they have related to each other in regional urbanization. You could have done it like that, but I wanted to know about the Upper East River and Long Island Sound, the eastern half of the city, because that was the one I was most familiar with, and I was, like all scholars do, trying to think about my case studies. And so I was interested mostly in the Bronx and Queens as the periphery I wanted to look at, because they're the ones that, besides Staten Island, are most often ignored. Brooklyn and Manhattan get lots of interesting history. But the Bronx, there was just so little, and I was so curious to know about these edges. And so I decided in my first, that's actually the first chapter I wrote. So it's actually, it's a good place to start. You didn't know that. But that's the first chapter that I wrote. And so I just said, I'm going to read everything I can in the late 19th century about the Bronx, which turns out to be a kind of short list. And I wanted to know about this peripheral edge because it seemed to capture to me the local people and the metropolitan reframing that is happening in the late 19th century. So in 1840, which is kind of mid-century, when this book opens, New York is Manhattan Island, political in its political jurisdictions. And its urban development is really the southern half of Manhattan Island. 59th Street, where Central Park starts today, is really the northern edge of the city. But between the 1840s and 1898, New York takes on, it annexes what is today the Bronx in two separate pieces in the 1870s and then again in the 1890s, actually 3 years before consolidation. And the city becomes a metropolitan region through the Bronx. It's the first time that it's not going to be an island insular city. It's going to have a sprawling network, and it's its only mainland connection to the rest of America is the Bronx. So all of these questions started to come up when I just started to read the archives deeply. And I thought, this is great. I'm going to write about the Bronx. And Andrew Haswell Green became like a real guide. He's a guiding light. And I couldn't believe when I started to read his reports and his papers, how much he had an ecological view. And as an environmental historian, we often are tasked with reading sources that have been looked at for political history or labor history or social history, and say, well, what other ways can we read these documents? Because it's as American history goes, it's one of the newer, it's now got a full generation or two of scholars working in it. But environmental history lets you read documents in New York City history and ask new questions, which is really fun. And all of a sudden, Green had all these kind of environmental framings to think about New York, and the Harlem is the center of that. He says it's crazy to look at just the southern half of the Harlem and not the northern half, that a river has two banks and it's a singular system, and that the city is really, it's hampering its own growth if it's using it as a border rather than as connective tissue. And so that's Green's perspective. And what I didn't expect on the other side is that when I too started to look at the Harlem as connective tissue rather than a geographic border, is that all these other people in what we would today call the South Bronx felt the same way. There are all these local political interests who are eager for the opportunity that urban growth on Manhattan represents. And it's some of the typical, right? We see some Tammany politicians who are there looking to create influence over new development, which is the classic Tammany Upper East Side, right? They're interested in growing their influence in public works. And I feel silly saying this to you, Rob. Have you heard about these people in Tammany Hall? But it is the case even in the 1870s in the Bronx, what's today the Bronx. And then there are lots of really very much local people who say like a little town that looks at the city grid of New York, which we call north, south, east, west today, but it's not north, south, east, west. It's actually kind of kitty cornered. It's not a cardinal grid. And they don't make a cardinal grid. They make a grid that matches the kitty corner grid of Manhattan, because they are envisioning themselves to be part of a greater future. And so I needed Andrew Haswell Green to help me see the Harlem as a place of connectivity. And then once I got up kind of into the archives of the Bronx, I realized that there were lots of interesting local voices, kind of German democratic reform parties and people who built streets and were frustrated by the really sharp inclines of the territory of what's today the South Bronx. It's striated by 3 rivers that have turned some famously poor infrastructures into kind of movie sets. If you've seen the movie The Joker, those famous stairs in the Bronx. There's a famous set of stairs in the Bronx because the elevation of the 2 streets, when you put a grid right on top, doesn't take into account that there's a gradient that would be terrifying on a sled, never mind in a wagon full of goods. And that we have stairs that connect streets rather than roadways. That's bad for commerce. So locals who are really interested in thinking about locally built urbanism as opposed to urbanism implied from far away from City Hall. And so when I got into the Bronx, there were just so many stories, and I scratched the surface. I look forward to the day where someone writes the full Bronx treatment, because there are so many more stories to be told. But Green helped me meet all these really interesting locals who knew they were important to the city, didn't have traditional City Hall positions of power, but worked really hard to have their voice shape growth.
And yeah, that's fascinating. So in this case, sort of local interest, local boosterism, local frustrations, and ultimately local agency was largely in accord with the central planner's grand vision. There are other times later on when maybe we don't see it pan out quite that way, but if you continue heading along the shore northeastward from the original New York City, you end up in, I guess, your home state of Connecticut. And there we're in chapter 1, and we're meeting someone I think everyone already is familiar with in very different contexts, P.T. Barnum. And if I can back up a moment to the first chapter, where you have Steinway and you have Barnum and you have these sort of entrepreneurial city builders who are doing it very locally. They're doing it clearly separate from New York. They're not seeking the same kind of connection, the same nature of connection, I should say, as your folks in what's going to be the Bronx are. But they have many similar, they're similarly intrigued by being connected to New York, and nature once again provides a way for that to be realistic. Can you talk about these characters and how you're putting both of them, not just Barnum, but Barnum and Steinway, in a different light in this story?
And they're both characters. It's the perfect, right? They're both larger than life, which makes them fun to read and read their letters and archives, and fun to write about. And they get back to that question you started with who counts as a city builder? Well, I would argue in the 1870s, local street improvement committees count as city builders. And I would also argue powerful people like William Steinway, one of the important politicians, culture makers, German-American exemplars of kind of the immigrant success story. And then P.T. Barnum, he's the king of what we would think of today as the kind of believe it or not kind of pop culture. The circus impressionaro, but he's much more than that, I discovered. And I learned about both of them by having to make, again, decisions about how to frame a metropolitan story, because you can't do every municipality. You can't look at every county government official. So I was making choices about what corner of the metropolitan region to look at. So I decided I'd look at the Northeast. And then I used the waterfront as a lens. Right? Then there were other ways you could do this. You could say, I'm going to look at public school choices as a lens into metropolitan relationships and identity, which would be a fabulous book. And there are great scholars doing that type of work. Or I could look at infrastructure, just purely infrastructure. You could tell a great history of highways of the 20th century through these questions. And there are scholars who do that. And I decided to look at waterfront because it's finite. And finite things tend to be fought about, and things that get fought about have archives, right? If people are mad, then something got written down. And I was interested in the environment of the shore as this multifaceted thing. The coastal property is a set of property rights and legal property regimes that are unique. The public trust doctrine, which in America says the American public has a right to access tidewash lands. The fact that coastal real estate is in the 19th and 20th centuries really economically important for industry. And then in kind of a post-industrial New York, it's about aesthetics and leisure and play. And then they always overlap. And so there's lots of people who are going to fight to have access to a thing. So I was interested in that, in these fights about kind of cultural and material nature along shore. And that got me to these two men, and it really is a gendered story here. These are about men with power in the political and social and cultural mix of late 19th century Gilded Age New York. And their visions of what New York would be. And I think it's really important that it's both about the future with William Steinway and P.T. Barnum. And William Steinway is in Manhattan, and he moves to create a company town, effectively. I argue a company town. I've had a little pushback that it doesn't count as a company town, but I have a broader view, and we can, if you're interested, we can talk about that. But what I think is effectively a company town in what northern Long Island City, the Astoria neighborhood of Queens. And he likes it because he sees it as part of a metropolitan network. It's close to Manhattan, but it's a little bit more controllable. It's also a place that he can invest in growth, and then he can personally profit from growth. But in investing, he builds infrastructure that then is really attractive to urbanites and invites urbanization. And P.T. Barnum does a similar thing, but the scale is much bigger. He's thinking in terms of kind of satellite cities or suburban counterparts to the urban core, which was by the late 19th century not unusual. Chicago's North Shore is full of stories like this. Greater Boston area is full of stories of kind of, you know, suburban networks and urban networks or satellite cities. That Bridgeport is a city that exists in orbit to the economic drives of New York. And I was fascinated to see how much latitude these men had to effectively experiment in urban form and city planning. And so that gets back to this question, who counts as a builder? Because today we have city planners who have advanced degrees in landscape architecture and urban studies and city planning. But in the late 19th century, it's not yet a profession in the way it is today. And so there's creativity, and people are interested in urban form. And there's regulatory systems in place, from nuisance laws, which date back to kind of colonial era New York, often are ecological and environmental, right? Like you can't dump this here because it's drinking water, or you can't butcher a cow here because it's drinking water. It's almost always drinking water. You can't bury the people here. Is drinking water. These are the kind of nuisance laws that we see in Philadelphia and Boston and New York. But these men have the latitude and finances and influence to, there's a little fake it till they make it, which is very Barnum, but also to implement what they think urban form should look like. And there's no professional to say otherwise. There's landscape architecture, and that's the proto-field to city planning. And so the great city planning lights of the early 20th century will look to landscape architects, like most famously Frederick Law Olmsted. But this generation of garden and landscape designers who then become kind of increasingly broader in scope, that all comes at the turn of the 20th century. And so in the late 19th century, what a city looks like is a place for real experimentation. And that's how I ended up with Barnum and Steinway. I actually wrote the Barnum section, and it was like its own little case study. And then the more I read about Queens, and this is just the kind of how I got to the archives and what semester and what summer I could get to which archives, which is not a glamorous story, but I could get to the fabulous archives at LaGuardia Wagner Community College's local archives are wonderful. This is like, I'm not a spokesperson for it, but I would like to plug how wonderful their archives are. By the time I got there, I said, oh, Barnum isn't doing this alone. There's actually, Steinway's doing the same thing. They really invest in roads and they invest in kind of sewerage systems, so piped water in, piping waste out. They invest in parks, they invest in housing. And I think you could find others. And these are my case studies. But once you start to look for a pattern of kind of business entrepreneurs with a civic sensibility, looking to make money for themselves through industrial and urban development in the city, my guess would be you could find one in every city in the satellite city of New York.
That's fascinating. Parenthetically, are there must be, there's Barnum papers somewhere. Are they at Wagner LaGuardia or are they somewhere else?
Barnum is harder to track down.
Yeah.
There is a Barnum museum in Bridgeport.
Right.
But I actually never got to get into the archives because Superstorm Sandy hit. These are just like the things of life, right? How everyone in 2020 has had this pause on archival research due to pandemic. Superstorm Sandy hit and really hurt the museum's collections, and it was closed for a long time. So the way I had to work around those archives through the Bridgeport Public Library's local history collection, which was wonderful, and then the real estate records in City Hall at Bridgeport, which have all of the transcripts for the buying and selling of property. And so there were some archives that you could get, but the local library, this is again a plug for doing local history, is really, it's just like microfilms at local libraries, which are as a real treat to do that type of work. And then City Hall tended to be useful. The other thing is that Barnum, as a showman, loved to talk about himself. And so he would be interviewed whenever anyone could interview him. He tried to like bully Mark Twain into writing a book about him at one point. So there's an interesting correspondence there. It didn't happen. And he also writes autobiographies over and over again. And he edits them as he goes. And so I could read his multiple autobiographies for as his progress in city building in Bridgeport grew, how he reinvented the story of city building in Bridgeport. You could trace it across the way he sold himself and sold his city. And then finally, he's probably as it was often said at the time, the best known man in America by the end of his life. And so there is endless, breathless from newspapers and literary kind of weeklies from Wisconsin and Kentucky and of course Connecticut and New York. But there's breathless stories about what Barnum is doing in Bridgeport. So once you start to look for Bridgeport and Barnum together, not just the Fiji mermaid or his elephants, then he shows up in lots of surprising places.
Well, that's great. And I appreciate and agree wholeheartedly with your plug for doing this work at the local level in the local libraries. I can still remember as a graduate student having my wife had a conference in Saratoga Springs, and I was like, well, while we're here, I'll wander down to the Saratoga Public Library and see what I can find, and randomly found some interesting tidbits. Just wherever you are, there's always going to be a good library with some good materials, and so that's fantastic. You mentioned that there's been pushback on Steinway. I think I've gone on the record as appreciating your presentation both of Barnum and Steinway, and I've suggested that you provide us with an alternative view and understanding of the Gilded Age company town, but that doesn't make it not so. And so I'm inclined to take your side on what I didn't know was a controversy, but if you'd like to
well, there's only a couple people who are very committed to the narratives, but enthusiastic. I think the idea of a company town, well, because I argue what the hallmarks of a company town: control over labor population, and if not total control, majority control. Kind of, I think, geographic control and controlling of transit access to and from that geography, and control of real estate. That is all part of this, the creation of what is known as a Steinway corner of Astoria, which is really part of Long Island City, all these kind of minutia of New York City neighborhoods. And they called it the Steinway section. And when you look at the property maps, Steinway owns just the vast majority of property. And there are a couple other, and I write about it in my book, there are a couple other companies, the Astoria Silk Works, for example, but Steinway is a partner in, and the Silk Works headquarters are often using the Steinway piano firm's offices for doing their paperwork. And so it's that controlling interest. And I think that Steinway was very self-aware in having a personal vision of what that city would be. And it was his vision, which is, to me, another hallmark of a company town, and where coercion comes in for, say, the famous town of Pullman, in cultural and kind of, reformist coercion. Steinway's also, he parallels that in the way that he fosters a German American cultural identity, and he is anti-union in that. And so that's another symbol of a company town that you can really start to create like a typography, even if it isn't the pure control of a mining town or a lumber town in the American kind of Wisconsin, Minnesota lumber town story, or a mining town. It's not Pullman, but I think there's enough there to understand it as a singular vision of singular control under a businessman for his profit.
No, I mean, as I said, I'm on the record as completely agreeing with that interpretation. I think, as you were speaking about the financial control, the labor control, I agreed with all that. And the one thing I was thinking is, and most importantly, it's his vision that is, and I think that's what really makes the case, as you pointed out. Now you talked about Steinway's interest in German culture. And I think that brings us at least a little bit to, I guess that's the third chapter, right, with the leisure corridor, and the idea that a lot of people from the city moving out are, it's not, when we say the center moving to the periphery and implementing a vision, this isn't what we usually mean. And so you talk about the working class suburbs of the leisure corridor, and a little bit of, now it has its limits, as you point out, but a little bit of opportunity for different kinds of cultural expression. I'd love to hear about that, because I think I didn't see this part coming. I didn't know much about this at all, and so I think it's a fascinating intervention. I'd love to just hear you talk about the leisure corridor and its rise and its diversity.
Yes, it's a story about, so what do people do on the shores of Greater New York? Well, they go to work. They fill ships with goods that go across the world. They build docks. They build land, because real estate in a port city is always really valuable. So they fill in marshland to make sellable property. And then people also go to the shore. It's a very kind of human, non-time specific trait since the early to mid 1800s, is that New Yorkers look for a place to cool off when it's hot. And they look for a place to relax, and not just New Yorkers, anywhere on the Eastern Seaboard. It's a really universal story of trying to find a place to relax in nature. And some people have the time and money to have a big fancy camp in the Adirondacks, right? Like a good Gilded Age baron. But this is another story that really spoke to me as a New Yorker moving through public transit. Is that, like, where can you go for a Saturday to just escape the crush of the urban grid? And so I was interested. I came to this because William Steinway and George Ehret, his partner for this project, who's a big German beer maker in the kind of Upper East Side Yorkville German enclave, decide to make a beer garden. And it's at the end of a trolley line. And this is a universal American story. How do you make money on a weekend on a trolley line? Put something at the end of it that people will pay to go to. And it's even better if, when they get there, there are amusements and rides and restaurants that they'll pay to buy things at. So again, this is kind of business bottom line that then creates community amenities. And that's what happens in Northern Queens. It's exactly where LaGuardia Airport is today. So it no longer exists. But it was a beer garden with a swimming pier and some roller coasters. And it was distinctly German American in the fact that German lager was easy to get and cheap. And one of the people who I write about from the Lehman College's or Bronx Oral History collection, which is interesting, right? It's the Bronx oral history question, which ends up writing about having the story of Queens, but it's an Irish family that moved through the city's boroughs. His family had a kind of a music hall, and they would show silent films, sell some soda like sarsaparilla sodas, or if you brought a keg, they would tap it for you in the field of undeveloped Queens behind. So there's kind of a real low, kind of low budget, but also low revenue place to hang out. And for late 19th century German Americans, that behavior is not welcome everywhere. There's great stories about when Central Park opens in the late 1850s, and the German Americans are like, this looks great. And they bring their tubas and their children and their lager. And the people who make Central Park are like, that is not what we had in mind on Sunday. Get off the grass. Is that a baby next to a keg? Like, what's happening? And so it really shocks the kind of elite Protestant community of what leisure and outdoor space looks like. And they can do that up on the East River. It's a little bit out of sight, out of mind. It's amongst other Germans. George Ehret is happy because he's selling his own beer. It's making Germans happy because it's a place where they can be themselves without discrimination, which is like a real problem in late 19th century American cities. And so it's just a perfect example of the opportunity of the undeveloped city edge. That's a place where people can experiment in urban form to meet their own needs. And they're really kind of working class people who want to kind of have a picnic in a field, in a beer garden, and just enjoy their families and their kind of cultural community for a weekend. And so those types of stories I found fascinating. And I was also charmed. It's always worrisome to be charmed by your history, right? You don't want to root for anyone because you want to tell a good and fair story. But I was interested in the way that everyday people were really shaping space. And that gets us back to this question of who gets to shape space and who gets to add value to urbanism. And it worked that it was undeveloped and that nobody had developed Northern Queens because it was boggy and hard to get to. And that worked very well. And there's similar stories across the East Bronx. And just basically every semi-picturesque point along Long Island Sound had a trolley park or a camp or a beach club. These stories are really kind of a universal response to undeveloped edges where land is cheap or unregulated, or maybe somebody owns it, but they don't really check and you can camp, or if you camp, it's a nominal fee. And I was drawn to that story of, again, it helps broaden who counts as shaping urban form and what are the value systems that get built into urban form, which is a real classic city planning history question. But in this case, it turns out to be people who are not written about in the kind of chronology of famous city plans. And oftentimes it's because these spaces don't last, right? They fade to development, they fade to pollution, fade to changing cultural tastes. By the late 20s, a kind of dinky summer camp seems unsophisticated when you can see there are other options. There are movie theaters and dance halls, and Coney Island is really kind of at its peak of sophistication. It then, of course, will become old-fashioned and trite in its own turn. Coney Island will. So that kind of hubris of kind of cultural, of hipness, if you will, it comes and goes. And so when these places are erased, we lose the way that everyday people shaped them. By, when you're standing in Co-op City, which is this enormous post-war tower in the park housing, you don't get the sense that there was homemade summer camps that then became, places of cultural connectivity.
First of all, I love that expression, the hubris of hipness. I don't know. I think you just coined that because I may quote you in the future. I love it. And some of them decide they want to live there, which I found that was the part that really I didn't see coming. They're drawn there. First of all, I think it's wonderful how you point out they're drawn there by this very understandable and to the present time relatable urge to escape the heat of a city. I believe you've written about that in popular media recently, about the heat islands still and what it means to be in the summer in a major city. But they're doing this at first to escape that phenomenon, but some of them decide they want to live there. And they do it in this really, I'm reading this the first time and I'm on the edge of my seat. I'm like, are they going to get away with this? Like, how are they going to pull this off? And you describe how these communities come together, and you want to talk about sort of grassroots
Real estate.
Agency and city building. I mean, it's another wonderful example. I mean, how, if you can talk about that briefly, it's fascinating to me.
This idea that you can transform a summer camp into permanent year-round housing when the housing market gets tight. And that's particularly true in the First World War. The housing market stalls, and then there's a real demand. And so to make ends meet in the late teens, people move to their summer camps, and then they live in them as they turn them into year round. So it's a real kind of homemade bungalow, and a lot of them still exist. And so if you ever have the chance to drive through what was Silver Beach or Edgewater Park or Harding Park, these are very modest 1,000-square-foot homes on very tiny lots with narrow streets. And the city till this day, if you're interested in city zoning, which I'm always trying to convince my students that city zoning is fascinating, and the audience is not on my team, but the city zoning today is still dealing with ramifications for how to zone these landscapes that are really self-built streets, because you can hardly get two cars down them, never mind when you need a fire truck, right? So there's these real kind of municipal questions of what to do with these unique landscapes of Harding Park, for example. And people want to park their cars on the street, like all New Yorkers. It comes down to, can you get a parking spot? And they turn these homes into year-round properties, but the way they it's a very complex and unique rental property system in which they own the building, but they rent the land. And so it's a land lease system, which is very rare in New York City. And they end up being turned into cooperatives, which is famous for the 1920s and 30s apartment buildings that are cooperatively owned by the tenants, which has its own fabulous history of housing in New York, this pushback against the kind of capitalist market to create an opportunity for cooperative working class home ownership. Today, cooperatives are having kind of different, marvelous Mrs. Maisel type of kind of she story to them. But a lot of them come out of labor unions and religious community groups that are looking to create housing that's affordable for an everyday New Yorker. So while my book is a city planning history, it's also a lot about how everyday New Yorkers function within those city plans, when the city plans ignore them, or where the city plans don't work, or they don't get there yet, or people just say, nah, it's not for me, I'm doing my own thing. So it's a way to create working class home ownership in a city that we don't consider to be about home ownership or about when we think about real estate in New York, it never goes to the working class first. You think of the ultra wealthy. And there end up being like these waterfront bungalow communities. There are 3 still left in the East Bronx. And what I love about them is that across the way is the Gold Coast of Nassau County, the North Shore of Nassau County, famously reimagined in F. Scott Fitzgerald. Looking forward now that we're out of copyright with The Great Gatsby, we're going to see all the retellings of this imagined landscape. But the rich want coastal estates as well, and they get the pristine views. And then these bungalow communities end up in places that are a little more gently scenic, but not everyone can afford a Newport mansion, or you mentioned a Saratoga summer retreat. People need what fits their budget, and an East Bronx homemade camp turned home fits lots of budgets. And so it's a way to add kind of diversity of city building experience to the history of real estate in New York. It's not every part of New York, but again, if you went to the South Brooklyn shore and started to look at the barrier islands there, you can find these stories too. They're out there as soon as you start to look at the local level. This is, again, you and I are starting to make why you should do history at your local branch library.
Well, I think it's great. And I think that the irony, I suppose, is that some of the factors that aside from the fact that it was available and less expensive, some of the environmental factors that attracted these folks to these regions ended up falling victim, I suppose, to this poorly planned or not centralized planned development. And I guess that flips the narrative a bit to maybe some of the central planning that's going on in this time, and how they're trying to control this sort of thing. And I think it's important that just as the creation of five-borough modern New York City, that story starts in the Bronx. It looks like the planning story for you really starts with the Bronx as well. How is the Bronx River Parkway and all of that sort of a test case for what comes later, and making the argument against the sort of improvisational grassroots city building that you're bringing into the story?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, the Bronx River Parkway is the first landscaped motor parkway in America in the modern sense of that you would drive down this aesthetically pleasing kind of curvilinear road without billboards or industry, or in the case of the Bronx River, Italian immigrants who have kind of modest homes along the river. That all gets erased. And Randall Mason's got a wonderful chapter in his earlier book about landscape preservation about this. So the Bronx River Parkway is like Robert Moses is to urban historians, to the people who are interested in landscape history and landscape design. The Bronx River Parkway is kind of unavoidably famous. And so it's this idea of leisure on the urban edge that is controlled from above by a regional authority, right? Often these are appointed authorities. They are not elected bodies, which is important in the way that they can impose a vision that is not directly answerable to a voting population. So the Bronx River Parkway is created opens in the 1920s. They started earlier to be a place of leisure on the urban edge, and that its cars are scenic and they're for play and pleasure. You would go for a Sunday drive, and if anyone has ever driven on the Bronx River Parkway, you know that still sometimes you come up to the entrance ramp and there's a stop sign, and then you're like, whoa, and you have to just like roll in to merge with traffic that no longer goes 35 miles an hour. It's a very exciting driving experience to get on the Bronx River Parkway. And there's lots of parkways across kind of the eastern seaboard that have that exciting kind of old-fashioned, modeled with very fast cars experience. So it's always a pleasure and terrifying to drive on those roads. You feel a little bit like you're on a roller coaster as you move through them. And so it's this vision that really inspires the state of New York. And this is where our research is so complementary and aligned. That the state of New York says, this is a really good idea. It raises property values. It makes the county of Westchester and the Bronx, they share this parkway. It makes county of Westchester look really modern. And the state of New York really gets behind this concept of a regional parkway and regional park planning, and the fact that this can't happen at a municipal level. There's too many environments, municipalities to move across. It needs to have some type of overhead a planning body from above. And the state of New York is interested in this in the 1920s because it has progressive governance that are looking for public goods. So Robert Moses gets his start writing a state park plan for New York, which is from a kind of reformist private group that they're advocating for park development. And it goes to Governor Smith, this guy I think you've heard of. And then Smith says, this fits my kind of vision of democratic reform and projects for the state. And so he is inspired by what's happening in the Bronx River Parkway, and particularly Westchester, because the county of Westchester itself is the first county north of the Bronx. And so it's the southernmost mainland county of New York State. So it's always had a very close relationship with the city, and it becomes a very popular suburb and a kind of avant-garde place for well-to-do suburban living. And it inspires the state. And then it really comes into maturation on Long Island. These ideas are taken up and championed as what it means to be a progressive suburban government in the 20s and the 30s. Modern parks, modern parkways, government control as opposed to the hurdy-gurdy Barnum style of entertainment is being rejected for moral play and professionally designed parks and parkways and landscapes for a modern public to play in. And so that then kind of comes of age on the famous parks and parkways of Long Island, not without a great fight, but mostly is celebrated by those people who use the facilities. The people who live next to the facilities don't always celebrate great public works because NIMBYism has a long history of saying, that sounds like it might be loud as a neighbor. But in the 20s and 30s, it's really part of the progressive good government that the state envisions for itself.
You make a couple of really important points here. I'll mention them both because I'd like to explore them both, and I don't want to forget. But one is, I've pointed this out to you, I think you have one of perhaps the most balanced, and I think appropriately balanced interpretation of Robert Moses, certainly in this period. And so you've introduced him. I'd love to hear more about Moses. But then there's also this idea that you mentioned a few minutes ago, in an earlier generation, in the directly earlier generation, working class people didn't have access to the premium spots for recreation, but they still wanted it. And so they went about doing it themselves. And by this time, some of that's either crowded or polluted or antiquated or become housing. So perhaps, and I'll let you assess this, there's an element of actually sort of grassroots democratic opening up access in this story. It's not all sort of these stern dictatorial planners. Maybe something good is happening for grassroots New Yorkers here, but I don't want to lead the interviewee, but that's one thought. But first, and maybe these are both the same question. I would love to hear your thoughts on Robert Moses and how you see him versus the broader literature, because you can't say Robert Moses without people drawing up sides very swiftly. And I think you navigate that very well. So
it's a dangerous thing to do at a cocktail party, right? You never want to tell anyone that you're writing about Robert Moses. Everyone has an opinion, which is great, because then, I do think there are avenues in to think about history critically. And I think Robert Moses is an avenue that we can invite lots of people in. So I was teasing, not just people who are interested in 1920s democratic progressivism like you and I are, but lots of people who have an inkling that Robert Moses is important, or they know is, from the era of COVID of bookshelves, that Robert Caro's The Power Broker is on people's shelves. And I think that Moses, when I teach Moses at school at Queens College, we have classes where we think about pre-war and post-war. Because his career is so long, I think we need to think about it in segments. And we need to not be not like a teleological perspective where we know what's going in the end, shape the way the questions we ask about early years, which is good history all around, right? We don't want to know what we're going to say at the end of it. We want to let our archives and our sources tell us the types of questions we can ask and answer in that moment. And so Robert Moses is interested in creating a public park system in the state of New York, and he works very closely with Al Smith as governor, and they're very successful in this. There are problems right off the bat. Moses is always appointed, never elected, and he amasses power. He writes the legislation that creates the State Council of Parks for the state of New York, and then he's appointed head of the State Council of Parks when it is made. And then that's in 24, and then in 25 he's appointed head of the Long Island State Park Commission, which is Nassau and Suffolk, so a huge swath of the state. He's in charge of that, and then by 34, he's at the head of the New York City Parks Department as well, and he's at the head of the Triborough Bridge Authority, which he has asked the state to create, which is again appointed. So he has all this power in a way that he's not sharing power and sharing the democratic vision. But he is interested in public works in a city that has had a real kind of growing pains, because William Steinway builds a park and he builds a beer garden, and it really works for his community. But we can't we can't find those places 30 years later as development grows, or those places are polluted because of where they sit in the kind of estuary of the greater New York industrial harbor, which is a really polluting system. And maybe not everybody wants to go to a place where there's lager beer, and those people should have a place on the water to play as well. And so these questions of access and equity, while I celebrate when local people can shape the shoreline for their own personal needs, it's always going to be a minority who has access to those places. And so in the 20s and 30s, we see vast public spaces that are really modern, that are made for the general public, as broad as it is in this moment. And it's never, whenever you define a public, there's always an implicit of those who are not invited. And so you can't define public without saying who isn't included in these spaces. But it is the most progressive we've seen in New York City's history by the 20s and 30s. And Moses is at the helm of that. And there's great debate about, does Moses like the public? I think it's Francis Perkins who says he likes the public from above, but doesn't actually like the individual people. He finds them a little crass and messy, right? The individual person eats a chicken sandwich and then has to throw that trash out, and that annoys Moses. But he likes the idea that there is a public good that should be served by public funds in high caliber public spaces, which is pretty revolutionary in New York at the time. So if you were living in Queens in New York in the 1920s, you watch with glee as Jones Beach opens and modern roadways open. And maybe you and your family can go out there and go to a beach that's much cleaner than the water is at Coney Island by you. And it's modern, and it's got beautiful tile and frescoes and design, and it's for you. And that's a really empowering thing for a regular person in Queens, right? If you get back to these regular people and how they interact with an urban plan. And so Moses himself, from everything we know and everything I've read in his letters, is he's a little vulgar and he's bossy. And I'm sure he would say it's not bossy if you know you're right. But then the person who says that might be a hard colleague to work with.
And his papers, I guess, New York Public Library. So you talk about different research experiences. There's sort of the local library with the microfilm, and then there's this palace that you enter, and you go to like the locked glass room in the back with like the dark green lights, and it's just very. He couldn't have designed it better himself, but that's beside the point. Ultimately, when we're studying any of this history, and one of the great contributions of yours is that you have to always keep that human perspective in mind. And I think it's actually, maybe it's something you could talk about here. It's something that I think is one of the many great merits of your book, Kara, is that you have these profound, sometimes sweeping interpretations that are really revisionist and really give us a good theoretical framework for applying this, as you've suggested, to perhaps other case studies. And yet it's not like floating off here, sort of irrelevant. It's always connected and grounded to the human factor in this story. Is there an approach in the sources, in the way you've done your research? You've talked a bit about it already, that you found useful?
By the end, was the cart leading the horse leading the cart in the beginning? By the end, I was determined to have the chapters alternate whose perspective of city planning. It goes back and forth from the local grassroots to the kind of levels of power within a government, whether it's a city government or a borough government or a state. And so it goes back and forth. And so the goal was that to never get too far away. For every chapter that is about Frederick Law Olmsted and Robert Moses and Andrew Haswell Green, there's a chapter about people like Solomon Riley, who's a African American, well, it's not even a good, he's a Black West Indian real estate investor who wants to build Coney Island that will be welcome to his community from Harlem, to welcome to Black recreationalists, which is, there's a kind of culturalized Jim Crow segregation in New York's leisure spaces in the 20s and 30s. And so for every Robert Moses, we get a real estate investor like Solomon Riley, who has to work a system for local people with limited funds to try to get a vision of his community to have a say in the city. And so the goal was that the chapters alternate, because you could tell this story just through the planners. And there's something lovely about planners who are building plans in the 1920s in this kind of the crest of this progressive tide, because they're very self-aware of their importance, and they're very self-secure in their importance, and they save all their letters.
Yeah.
So you can go and you read the correspondence, and they're mimeographed. So there's the letter that got sent out and then the letter that came back in, and you have the complete correspondence. And it's very easy to write this history, city planning history, in this moment because of the technology of how mimeograph letters work and the self-awareness of record creation and archival creation that these men have. And there's still men at this moment. The city planning era and the professionalization in the teens and 20s is still a gendered profession largely. There are some women who manage to carve a voice in landscape design and kind of domestic landscape design that then expands their careers, or in play reform and playground reform, which comes out of progressive era, kind of women's municipal housekeeping, where women can make a claim to have political right and power, but it's still really mostly men in this moment. And so I worked really hard. So I'm happy that you noticed I worked hard to not have it just be a story of the top down, because in the end, I'm going to be a New Yorker who comes and goes and lives her life. And I will be the kind of the person whose letters don't get saved and whose story would just be in the collective community story. And so I, as a person who's not a politician or a city builder or, a power broker, I'm interested in the lives of people who are more like me than the most famous landscape architect in America by the 1920s, right? Gilmore G. Clark. Like, he's wonderful, but he's not everyone.
And then you've got the pushback.
I write about lots of people who are courting regionalism, city planners and everyday folk, but there's never consensus. I mean, no municipality has consensus, and there's always someone who's going to reject the vision that regionalism is a collective whole, that there's a collective good and a collective system that should be planned. It's very natural that we see pushback against that, because some people say, well, I don't apply, or my community doesn't apply, or I don't want my fate and my fortunes attached to this community or this price tag for this project. And so the North Shore of Long Island is a place where this happens. Famously, Moses meets some matches in the very wealthy, in the kind of, the DeForests and the Goulds, the real deep pockets of the mansion communities, the estate communities of the Gold Coast of Long Island, which is Fitzgerald's kind of imagined East and West Eggs, kind of Sands Point of the North Shore of Long Island. So these people who really reject creation of a commonality, and that public spaces should be included in their access, public space should happen in their communities. That is that they move to these estate enclaves to isolate from a growing cosmopolitan big government city. And so Nassau County exists because it was once part of Queens County. In 1898, Queens County, the western end, votes to join Greater New York as a borough of the city. The eastern end rejects that common ground. And so the next year, 1899, Nassau County is created. It exists because its residents rejected inclusion in a metropolitan whole. And so we see that in the way that park systems, the metropolitan region, it wouldn't surprise you knowing that that's how it was created, and rejection of the Tammany politicians who are running the city and the immigrants who make up its laboring populations, the fact of a laboring population at all, it's all part of that rejection. And so what is a rural agricultural place is increasingly bifurcated on its really beautiful coastal cliffs to be an estate enclave. And those people are very successful in pushing back on a vision of community good with really interesting results, because of it, there is an intensive suburbanization in the way that lots of places in Long Island become very roundly critiqued for in the 1960s and the 1970s, and the sociologists who are kind of wringing their hands about, bowling alone in the end of culture because of suburbia. So Nassau County, there's unintended consequences of sprawl that it doesn't undergo because of its estate communities. But they too will be flashes in the pan, with income tax and property taxes that shift in the early 20th century. It's personal income tax and personal property taxes aren't necessarily like a hot button history topic, but it really changes how owning an estate works. And then the Great Depression will really break those apart. And Moses is gleeful when those estates start to crumble, because he sees them as backwards facing, feudalist, and not American, right? So it's a moment where he would then champion the masses against these what he saw as kind of unrealistic snobbery of the really well-to-do. So he's a complicated man, that Robert Moses.
It's fascinating. Yeah, I mean, he loves the masses when they're, I suppose, politically useful to furthering his vision, and then when they show up
Yes.
at his park and make it dirty, they get on his nerves. But
Mhm.
it's yeah, that's interesting. And it is, there is something incredibly prophetic about the fact that Nassau County's entire existence is a rejection of New York City and of being integrated as regionalism. Um, and yet the depression does happen. There are forces that do start to break down some of the resistance to integration, never completely, as you point out, but they provide opportunities for the regionalists, for the Moseses, Mosai, I don't know, for Robert Moses and people of his ilk. And there's this incredible convergence in the 30s of crisis in Queens, suddenly funding from the federal government, funding for the big party they're going to have, and recognition that they need to do something more sustainable and better planned out than the kind of sewer, among other things, crises that they brought on themselves. And so is the 30s really when your whole story flips from being one of development to one of the sort of, now we've arrived, this is the moment they're going to implement all these various trends you've been describing, and now it's modern New York? Or is that too simple?
I think in a lot of ways, 1940 Queens World's Fair, which is kind of the dumps to glory is what they call it, right? That's the kind of the guidebook's slogan. It's the culmination of 100 years of growth of metropolitan rings and metropolitan conceptualization and big infrastructure projects. And I think it's an important place to pause this history and end that chapter, because post-war Long Island and New York is going to be a totally different set of levers for people with power or people wanting to have power to pull. Particularly the Title I of the 1949 Housing Act, which is going to create slum clearance programs, and then the federal FHA guarantee of mortgages, which is created in 34, but really comes into its own with suburbia. And so the way that real estate is racialized and suburban growth is racialized, and how slum clearance reshapes cities and the tower and the park, there's all these like big design questions that are often unfulfilled, and a creation of really systemic racial inequality in American cities that is kind of built into the infrastructure through the levers of power that come out of the post-war era. And so there's fabulous and maybe unending work about what urban renewal means for New York. And Robert Moses plays a really important role in urban renewal, and his legacy is almost always one of that New Yorkers, historians of New York, look at with real regret at the way it builds inequality and the way it hurts the fabric of the city, with big highways across the South Bronx, and the dislocation of communities, of working class communities, and to build places like Stuyvesant Town on the east side, or Lincoln Center on the west side, or the UN, all these symbols of modernity of the post-war modern landscape. It's a very different city than this type of infrastructure, and where people find money and where people find power and who holds that power. The story of post-war New York has been written about extensively and beautifully, and the scholarship is still growing. But all those power systems change. And so I think 1940 is a place where I see a natural conclusion. It's also the wrapping up of the New Deal, which is the culmination of funding for New York, which is, as a scholar of the progressive era, and then Al Smith, you know this just as much as anyone else, with LaGuardia as mayor in the Depression and FDR in the White House in DC. The funding is outrageous in New York City. New York City is the 49th state for relief. $1 in $7 of WPA funds are spent in New York City. Transforms the city's landscape. And a lot of it is in Queens, and a lot of it is really welcomed. Like Astoria Pool, these are all kind of maybe too local things. But if you ever get to go to a public pool in New York City, or Astoria Pool is twice 2 Olympic-sized pools together underneath this beautiful bridge in a beautiful park. And it's modern and it's clean, and it's a lot cleaner than swimming in the East River. And so all these real public goods that change people's lives, playgrounds and pools, and the World's Fair is one of those places. And so it's Flushing Meadows Park. So if you've ever watched a Mets game or gone to see tennis, or what's that movie? Have you seen the first Men in Black? It's the finale is in the World's Fair site. And so it's built for the first time in 39 and 40 under Moses and Parks commissions and federal New Deal funds. It all comes together. And it's called, it was Dumps to Glory because Fitzgerald, before he titled The Great Gatsby, this famous title, he calls it Between the Dumps and Millionaires, Ash Heaps and the Millionaires, because of there's actually like a coal ash dump in the park. And that kind of the difference between that and the estates of neighboring, just like 10 miles down the road, can be more clear about the futures of these places. But yeah, the 39-40 fair really culminates this sense of hope during the Depression, of modern infrastructure, federal funding, government funding, and it celebrates suburbia too.
It seems like this incredibly optimistic moment. I mean, some of the images that you use in that chapter of sort of these connections and what is it called? Futuramia?
Futurama, which is General Motors, GM's.
Yeah.
Very expensive exhibit to convince you need to buy a car.
But I think it's fascinating too, because you talked briefly about all the trends that other scholars have talked about post-World War II. You've set up the world, you've set up sort of the rules of the game that those people are playing by. Now, some of them are the same people, like Moses, or the same people doing different things or what have you. But I think it's really fascinating because you give us the entire backstory that none of that really is possible. And you point out that the things that I wish I had your precise quote in front of me, but the things that we associate with modern New York, the highways, even the suburbs, it's not the creation necessarily of these top-down central planners, but of this process that you so convincingly narrate. And so I agree with you that it's a really important turning point and an ideal in many ways place to sort of wrap up your story. Thank you so much for talking about this with us.
I'm happy we talked about local archives. I think that sometimes you say, I'm going to write another book about New York City history. And people say, why would you do that? There are so many of them. And part of it's liberating. You're like, well, it's okay that I'm not going to find a new borough, right? There isn't a sixth borough that no one knows I'm going to tell this story of. But that fascinating public figures, always fascinating, and we shouldn't tell the history of New York City without LaGuardia or Robert Moses. We need to understand these people. But we miss so much if we don't think about the local archives and the stories that they can tell us if we're willing to take seriously the lives of regular New Yorkers. That regular New Yorkers have dreams of a metropolitan city. They have dreams today of what a future city should look like. And they want to shape their city just as much as a politician does, maybe even more, because they live with the ramifications of inequality and environmental decline and public services and public infrastructure that needs to be addressed, right? The Bill de Blasio's experience of a slow F train is very different than someone else who must take the train to get to work. And so I think that local history, all politics is local, they say. But local history and local municipal archives, neighborhood libraries, branch libraries are places we can still tell new histories about New York, particularly in the outer boroughs. There's so much to write about in Queens and the Bronx. And I will always read the next book about Central Park. Don't get me wrong. Like, I'm always here for that history. And I'm fascinated by new analysis, and new smart analysis is always out there. But I think there's local people and local histories that can tell us a lot about big picture ideas if we're willing to give their voices kind of like equal access. I'm happy that we talked about the heroism of a branch library.
I am too, and that's really well put. What are you working on now? Tell me about that.
I'm writing an urban environmental history of New York City pre-climate control. And again, it gets to everyday life. My experience with weather and nature, environment as an aspect of nature, and weather as an aspect of environment is in the rain and the slush and cold weather and gale force winds that come off the bay. And so, well, Central Park is there and it's a big piece of environment, and the Bay is there and it's a big piece of environment. My tactile, everyday experience of environment is through weather. So it shapes the way I live in my private space, how I interact with public spaces, when I'm hot and when I'm cold, if the snow gets cleaned off the street or not. These are all everyday questions of environment. And so I'm looking at a history of interaction with environment as understood through weather in late 19th and early 20th century, pre-climate control, because the air conditioned nation of post-war America hides a lot of these challenges for people who can afford AC. But I'm interested in the environmental questions and the way public space is used and how people approach hot days and ice storms in the late 19th and early 20th century in their everyday lives. So how do you keep an apartment warm? What happens if you can't afford coal? What do you do when it's really hot? How do you cool off in a city that has so much kind of retained heat? So that's what I'm writing right now. It's been really fun. It's been really fun to read about everyday New Yorkers. And it's really just social. It's another social history. And I was looking at the people when they don't go out to Jones Beach for the day. What are the other 6 days of the week like?
That sounds fascinating, and I look forward to reading it and hopefully talking to you about it sometime.
Well, there's many a page to go, Rob, but one day we'll get to talk about spending the night up on a tenement roof in August.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, Kara, for being with us here on Empire State Engagements, and I'm so grateful for your time, and thank you very much.
It's been a true pleasure.